We're back after a week off. It's Tuesday, 9:30 Eastern Time. Welcome once more to the Combat Press Midweek Report. I'm your host, Eric Reinert. Joining me, as always, from the Chicagoland area, one of the best sources and opinion makers, really, on women's mixed martial arts, and mixed martial arts generally speaking, in the game today, Riley Cobra Contact. Riley, how you doing today?
Hey, thanks, man. That's nice of you. I'm doing well. How you doing?
Not too bad. The reason we, on a bit of a personal note, not that anybody cares, the reason we were off last week, bam, got the ring on the finger now, and I was way too busy finishing the plans for that stuff to do the show. So apologies to both of our regular viewers for missing the program last week, and hopefully we'll make it up for you this week. Before we get to the topics at hand, of course, as always, we want to mention the folks who make this all possible, and of course I'm talking about CombatPress.com, Brian Henderson, Rob Tatum, and the rest of the fantastic staff at CombatPress.com. Check them out, all the latest news, interviews, and opinion in the world of mixed martial arts. Once again, that's CombatPress.com. Give them a follow on Twitter at CombatPress, and of course like the Combat Press page on Facebook. We've got a pretty nice little schedule for this show this evening, Riley. I'm excited to talk about all this, particularly because we've had that week off. UFC 178 was a card that, in my mind, delivered 100% to the hype that was generated around it, and that's a fortunate fact. So we'll talk about all of the main card fights from UFC 178 this last weekend. We'll also talk about this coming weekend's two UFC Fight Night events, one on Fight Pass and one mostly on Fox Sports 1. And we'll talk about both of those. We've got a couple of other topics that we want to get to, including a brief analysis of Battleground's MMA, which is going to be a one-night tournament hailing from Tulsa, Oklahoma. So we'll talk about that and a few more other things on this edition of the Combat Press Midweek Report. UFC 178, as I mentioned, certainly a feather in the cap for a promotion that has had a rough summer with regard to pay-per-views. Of course, we're talking about UFC 174 kind of having the weak main card and then kind of failing to deliver even on the very low expectations that I believe were set for it. UFC 175 was all right, but then, of course, they canceled UFC 176 after Jose Aldo was injured and could not fight against Chad Mendes, and really the one marketable fight from that main card. And then, of course, all of the various things that happened to make UFC 177 one of the most maligned pay-per-view cards in quite some time. So UFC 178 on paper looked fantastic. Just four really great fights, and then Demetrius Johnson defending his flyweight title. Of course, if it had been the original main event, which was John Jones versus Daniel Cormier, this probably would have been the best card of all time. But even without that, this was one of the better cards, probably the best card of the year, certainly on pay-per-view, and one of the best pay-per-view cards in recent memory. So, Riley, I've got a number of questions. We saw a number of great things that happened last Saturday night. Of course, the main event was Demetrius Johnson defending his title against a clearly overly matched Chris Carriazo. He made it look pretty easy, just as he has in most of his fights thus far as flyweight champion. So really the one question I have for you, Riley, is can anyone pose a legitimate threat to Demetrius Johnson's title?
About and after he comes off that knee surgery and maybe takes a fight or two coming back, I think he's one of the best matchups just because he can match speed with him, and he's probably a better striker. Other than that, I think the only other guy that I think really is, and this might be controversial, is Ian McCall, because just how he treated him in their first fight. I think that he should have won their first fight between him and Mighty Mouse, and it was a draw or whatever. So I personally think that McCall is a really good matchup because he has just as good of wrestling as Johnson. Maybe not as quick, but he's good with his footwork at the same time.
Yeah, I was looking at a couple of people's records in the flyweight division prior to our show tonight, and I noticed that the fight between John Dodson and Demetrius Johnson was actually closer than I remembered. I mean, obviously Johnson came out victorious by decision, but two judges had it 48-47, which is, about as close as you can get while still winning a decision. So I too am looking forward to a rematch with John Dodson, particularly because Dodson has displayed such greatness in the time since his fight with Demetrius Johnson. Let me ask you one other question. Do you see anybody coming down from 135 to potentially try to contend for the flyweight title at this point?
No, I think if they were gonna drop down, especially if they're in the UFC at this point, and challenge in the flyweight division, I think they would have done it already. A lot of the guys that are at 35 now are legitimate 35ers. They're guys that can't drop down. They're guys that have dropped from featherweight too. So I don't really see anybody there currently, but you never know with guys coming off the regional circuits or coming over from different companies. You never know. I mean, once you get to the small weight classes, it's hard to cut weight classes. If you're a heavyweight and you're carrying around a lot more fat, it's easy to get down to light heavyweight and middleweight. As when you're a small guy that's a bantamweight, it's really hard if you're a solid bantamweight to get down 10 more pounds just based on body proportion.
In your opinion, who performed better given their circumstances? Chris Carriazo being the 8th ranked fighter facing Demetrius Johnson, or Joe Soto being an unranked fighter taking on TJ Dillashaw at UFC 177?
I would say Joe Soto. He put up more of a fight. He was tougher. I think Johnson's better than TJ Dillashaw is, but I think Soto, given the 1-day notice and and coming into that fight, I think that he put up a much because I still think he's a really, really tough fighter.
Could you see Demetrius Johnson perhaps making a trip back to bantamweight to try to challenge for that title at some point?
At some point, I still think he does have some work to do in the flyweight division. Remember, it is a young division, so you don't want to just throw him up right away, because then what does that say about the division? Oh, they're not important enough for the champion to stick around, and we just made this division for him. So I do think he still has some challenges left there, but I think somewhere down the road, maybe 2.5, 3 years, I would love to see him in maybe like a super fight with a bantamweight or something. But I don't think that it's a good time to do it yet, at least.
Okay. The co-main event of UFC 178 was a highly anticipated fight between lightweights Donald Cerrone and Eddie Alvarez. I was struck by the height differential there at the stare down. I guess I didn't realize that Donald Cerrone was as tall as he was. You don't think 6'1" is that much taller than 5'9", but that was a significant difference on camera.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Cerrone obviously wins in a pretty dominant decision over Alvarez. Does this result serve more to expose Alvarez for being more of a mid-tier lightweight, or does it show that kind of where Donald Cerrone is and truly in the prime of his career, or is it both?
It's hard to say. Alvarez, Donald Cerrone is one of the most active fighters in major MMA organizations, and you remember Eddie Alvarez has had like a fight in the last 2.5 years. So yeah. There's that makes a big difference. That being said, listen. I think Alvarez is going to be very successful in the UFC. He's a very well-rounded guy. He's beaten some tough guys in Bellator, guys that could be in the UFC. I think he just ran into a guy that is on a tear right now. Donald Cerrone. And this is going to be stealing from the old BJ Penn cliche, but a motivated Donald Cerrone is a very, very, very dangerous Donald Cerrone. There was a stretch about 1.5 years, 2 years ago where he would admit it, he was not motivated to get into the cage, and he had some awful performances. And ever since then, it started around that time he had that Chicago fight, or maybe even a fight before that. He said that I found my passion to fight again, and he's looked like that guy that looked like he was on a crash course to be in the lightweight title picture. And I think at this point he could be the top contender. Rafael dos Anjos and Nate Diaz are going to fight, but I don't think Diaz is anywhere near the title yet. Dos Anjos could be, and plus he has a win over Cerrone, but Cerrone is free right now. So if anything were to happen with the lightweight title picture, like I might be hearing some rumors about on the hush-hush, not anything, it's kind of been on the circuit on Twitter, we could see Cerrone fighting for the title sooner rather than later, especially given his winning streak.
Talking about winning streaks and potential title fights, it's tough not to mention a guy like Conor McGregor. of course, in the featherweight division. He came out and, he put it to Dustin Poirier. That was luck it's a tough word to use in the world of sports because, there's a lot of skill that goes into it. But it was kind of when a person thinks of the cliche right place, right time, that's what it was when Conor McGregor's fist met the back portion or the behind Dustin Poirier's ear and kind of started the quick train to night land for Mr. Poirier. Given the performance that Conor McGregor displayed both at UFC 178 and in his previous UFC fights, do you believe that Conor McGregor right now is ready from a skill perspective for a title shot in the featherweight division?
I'd like to see him fight a wrestler first, but given that he's a box office draw and he's like the hottest ticket in MMA right now, I would love to see him get a title fight just based because he could be a pay-per-view draw. I don't agree with Dana saying that he's bigger than Lesnar or GSP, but I definitely think in this pay-per-view market where you're seeing lower and lower numbers than previous years, maybe like the golden years when you had Chuck Liddell and all these other huge draws, I think it's time to pull the trigger. And I know it's going to be a controversial decision, but he's a guy like Chael Sonnen that has earned it with his mouth, but he's also backed it up with his skills. Now, I think that although I picked Dustin Poirier to win that fight, I do think it was I think it was a tailor-made matchup in retrospect because Poirier would have had to get that fight to the ground, but he's content standing. So he was going to stand up and bang just because he was so emotional fighting McGregor. So I think if they put him up against an American wrestler, I don't think he's going to fare, especially like a high-level guy like in the top 15 that has really good wrestling. But when Aldo Mendez clears up next month, and say Aldo wins, and because if Aldo lost, you get an immediate rematch. Say Aldo wins, I would pay to see McGregor Aldo. I would love to see that, even though I still think McGregor it's a little too fast for him.
I agree, and I think a lot of people would not only pay to see Aldo versus McGregor, but I think a lot of people would pay to see McGregor potentially get shut up by Jose Aldo.
Right.
You mentioned Jose Aldo, who is facing Chad Mendes for his featherweight or for Aldo's featherweight title at UFC 179 later in October. Let's say Mendes wins, and of course then you have the rubber match between Aldo and Mendes. If that occurs, who do you think is the next opponent for Conor McGregor, or do you think he waits for a potential title shot?
I don't think he would wait. It's hard to say who his next matchup would be because if he wait, then it would become another instance where you have to have another number one contenders fight. They have that UFC Fight Night in Austin between Cub Swanson and Frankie Edgar, and I think that would make the most sense, honestly, if he had to wait around for Aldo Mendez 3 to take place. And that honestly makes the most booking sense out of anything if that were the case.
Well, especially given what you were saying about McGregor never having faced an American wrestler, somebody like Frankie Edgar would make an ideal test for him in that respect.
Right, and plus Edgar's a guy that would stand on the feet with him and has the skills to stand on the feet with him, so it would be very interesting.
Later on earlier in the main card at UFC 178, we saw what I thought was maybe the toughest fight to call before it took place, a middleweight contest between Tim Kennedy and Yoel Romero. Much has been said, of course, about the controversy between rounds involving Yoel Romero's corner, and I'm gonna leave that to other people. Here's my one question about this fight for you: Chris Weidman, Vitor Belfort, Jacare Souza, Yoel Romero. Which of those four or somebody else will hold the middleweight title 1 year from now?
Chris Weidman. I think he is literally the best fighter in the world right now. Other than John Jones, I take that back. He's the second best fighter in the world right now.
Probably.
And he's only here's the thing though, he's only getting better. John Jones is pretty much at the point where he's so good that he's not probably going to get a whole lot better. Weidman has places he can improve, but he's improved at such a fast pace that it's actually quite unbelievable. He went from being a guy that entered the UFC and had pretty much nothing but wrestling to being this guy that is just a stand-up phenom and is outboxing and outstriking guys like Lyoto Machida, which is incredible if you think about it.
Yeah.
I think that Weidman will get past Vitor Belfort in February. It won't be easy. Actually, no, I take that back. A clean Vitor will be much easier fight, in my opinion. I think he's much weaker, and I think that he's going to be, drained a little bit, if that's the word. And then if he faces Jacare, that's a horrible matchup for Jacare because on the feet, he's gotten better, but Weidman is clearly a better boxer, and he's not going to be able to take Weidman down because Weidman's wrestling is just so much better. So I think that's a bad matchup for him. And if Yoel Romero were to get a title shot, he has the power to knock out Weidman, but he doesn't have the versatility. He might have better wrestling, but Weidman has better MMA grappling.
Yeah, when I was watching the fight between Yoel Romero and Tim Kennedy, the prevailing thought that I had was that whoever wins this fight doesn't have anything for Chris Weidman, just because,
Right.
As you said, not only does Weidman possess the skills, but he just seems to have this tenacity about him where he's not about to let a guy escape and hope for a decision victory. Like, he goes in for the kill, and it's not in the same kind of flashy way as, say, an Anderson Silva did or even John Jones, but he has such an effective aggression that really makes him dangerous in the middleweight division. So I think despite Romero's considerable skills, as well as those of the other two fellas we mentioned, I think I agree with you that Weidman will probably still have the title come 1 year from now. Speaking of titles, Ronda Rousey, probably the most... certainly in the conversation for being most dominant champion in the world of mixed martial arts, period. The opening fight on the main card of UFC 178 featured the woman who will face her next, Kat Zingano, with a fairly impressive comeback performance against Amanda Nunes, who herself performed pretty well in that first round. I was impressed by both of these women, and frankly can't wait to see Amanda Nunes' next fight. Kat Zingano, of course, earns her title shot, long awaited, against current champion Ronda Rousey. Does Zingano have anything that can threaten Rousey's title?
Well, here's the thing. She had a pretty bad injury in that fight that's going to keep her out for a little bit. If you saw the medical suspend they released yesterday. So I don't actually think that she's going to be the next person that Ronda fights.
Oh.
I think when she gets healthy, she'll get the next crack.
Okay.
I think she's going to be out for about 6 or so months or so. She gets some sort of upper back something. We'll see how that plays out. But in the meanwhile, they want Ronda to fight in the next couple of months. And if Kat Zingano's not ready to go, she will wait for her title shot while somebody else fights. Who it is, I'm not 100% sure. But, maybe Betcha Koheda gets her wish. Not that I think she's ready, but maybe she gets her wish just because they want Ronda to fight.
Right. I think that would be a situation similar to what we're seeing in the flyweight division, where the main likely contender is on the shelf, John Dodson.
Yep.
And therefore you pluck somebody lower from the division who has the credentials on paper, like Betcha Koheda or Chris Carriazo have, by virtue of his 3 straight wins. If only, again, because of the dominance that both Johnson and Rousey have shown in their respective divisions. So, yeah, I think that's a pretty prescient prediction on your part there, Riley, about Betcha Koheda. But we'll see how that all plays out. Best of luck to Kat Zingano in a hopefully much quicker recovery than the one from her previous injury to her knee. This weekend, hopefully, the two lot to live up to from UFC 178. Before we get to this weekend's cards, Riley, anything else besides the main card fights and, of course, Dominic Cruz's absolutely dominant decision over Takeya Mizugaki that you'd like to mention?
Well, it wasn't a decision. Cruz clobbered him in the first round.
Oh yeah, his decision by non-decision. That's what I meant.
Yeah, there you go. But no, I was really again impressed with George Masvidal's his performance against James Krause. I know that was a little bit of a step down in competition, but James Krause is a very, very dangerous guy and a very solid mid-carder in that lightweight division. So the fact that Masvidal beat him as handily as he did, I was very, very impressed. And he just keeps getting better too. He's another guy that's continually getting better.
All right. Fantastic night at the fights, and hopefully this weekend's fights live up to them. There are 2 cards coming up on October 4th. That's this Saturday. One is coming to us from Stockholm, Sweden, and one from Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. The Stockholm card is the one we will discuss first because it's happening earlier in the day. The whole thing takes place on UFC Fight Pass. The prelims start at 12:10 p.m. Eastern Time with the main card beginning at 3 p.m. Want to just talk about a couple of fights on this card. The co-main event is a featherweight one between Akira Corsani, and Max Holloway. My question for you, Riley, is how far can we reasonably expect Max Holloway to advance in the featherweight division?
Well, he's really young, so he has a lot of room to improve, and he's been doing a very good job improving as of late.
Agreed.
Until he really tightens up his ground game, he's going to have a lot of trouble with higher level guys, especially. But again, he's a young guy, so he's got plenty of time to work on that ground game. And I think if he continues to work conscientiously on it, I think he's gonna be a guy that sticks around the top 20 for a long time. And this is a great matchup for him too, because Corsani's a striker himself, so he's gonna get a guy that's gonna entertain him where he likes to fight. So
prediction for Holloway, then, I presume.
Holloway will win this one, and possibly by a mid-round TKO.
All right. The main event on the Stockholm card features Gunnar Nelson, the 12th ranked welterweight in the UFC, taking on Rick Story. Two men have defeated current welterweight champion Johnny Hendricks. One is longtime former welterweight champion George St. Pierre, and that was a pretty close fight. The second fight was not quite as close, and that fight was won by Rick Story. Since then, however, he's kind of taken a tumble. Well, since then and his win over Thiago Alves, he's kind of taken a tumble, alternating wins and losses here and there. Let me ask you this first. Have we seen the last of Rick Story as a credible welterweight threat, or could this be the beginning of his comeback to glory in the welterweight division?
Well, I think that Rick Story is still a very good welterweight. I think his move to the MMA lab in Arizona was a fantastic idea. He's just adding tools to his arsenal. So I think that he's going to have a resurgence. The thing I have a problem with him is a lot of times he gets too comfortable on the feet when he is a guy that should be taking the fight down every single fight. For him, though, he's always going to stick around in the UFC as one of those guys that is always just right there but never actually gets past the threshold to superstardom. Yeah. I think this is a really good matchup for him, actually. I don't think he's going to win this because I'm not jumping off the Gunnar Nelson train, but this is like almost a tailor-made matchup for him because the striking, Nelson might be a little more quick on the feet or technical, but, Story is a guy that's aggressive, and he gets your back against the cage and makes you uncomfortable. So you've seen it against Thiago Alves. He did the same thing. So I think he should have a similar, game plan against Gunnar Nelson here. On the ground, Nelson's no picnic. He's a very, very good jiu-jitsu fighter. But we've seen in the past that American wrestlers are able to stifle Nelson, jiu-jitsu in general. So, it's easy to see how Story can win here, but at the same time, I just find it hard that Nelson's going to lose here.
Yeah, I agree. I think this one is a little bit tougher to call than it might seem on paper because Gunnar Nelson is obviously undefeated and kind of streaking through his performances in the UFC thus far. But like I said, I can't get past the fact that Rick Story, first of all, he's only 30 years old, so it's not like he's past his prime, and the fact that he performed so well against such a highly rated guy, a few years ago, and certainly still in Johnny Hendricks. Definitely, it always gives me pause. I think this is a great test for Gunnar Nelson, especially. Even though Rick Story, obviously unrated at this point and not as highly thought of as perhaps in years past, a win over him is going to cement Gunnar Nelson as a credible contender. Elsewhere on the card, obviously taking place in Sweden, it's going to feature a lot of European fighters. Which European fighter besides Nelson should fans pay attention to most closely on Saturday afternoon?
It's a guy making his UFC debut and a guy who I've been looking forward to for a long time. They finally signed him. His name is Scott Askham, and he is from the UK. This guy is an awesome fighter. If you've never seen him, check him out on YouTube. Fantastic striker. Very, very good striker. Very clean, very technical, very powerful. He's a big guy for 185, and he's a guy that has been causing some havoc on the UK regional circuit against some pretty tough guys too. I am excited. He's got a really, really tough UFC debut against Magnus Sedenblad, but I think that he has a very good chance to be successful in the UFC.
Riley, can I just say that I like that I can just ask you a question like that about European MMA fighters, and not only can you come up with an answer right away, but then talk about it in detail for like a minute.
Uh,
I could never do that,
yeah.
and that's, dude, that's admirable. That is
I
admirable. I
watch
appreciate
I
that
watch
knowledge.
I watch incredibly too much MMA, and I always pay attention to the prospect scene. And this is a guy who, in my opinion, the last couple of years is probably one of the top middleweight prospects in the world. So I'm really happy they got him.
Impressive knowledge, very much on your part, Riley. The second card on Saturday takes place that evening from Halifax, Nova Scotia. The prelims begin at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on UFC Fight Pass. More prelims begin at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on Fox Sports 1. And then, of course, the main card begins at 10 p.m. Eastern Time on Fox Sports 1. I want to talk once again about the co-main event and main event fights on this card. Rafael Assunção was supposed to get a bantamweight title shot at UFC 173 before an injury precluded him from taking on Renan Barão. Of course, we all know what happened in the months since. He takes on instead Brian Caraway, who is ranked 10th in the UFC's bantamweight division. Is there any reason to think, given that Assunção was previously considered a legitimate title contender, is there any reason to think that he doesn't just walk through Brian Caraway on Saturday night?
Well, you know what? This is another matchup that's hard to call because styles make fights, and Caraway is a guy with good wrestling and very very sound submission and submission defense. All right, so you have Assunção's a jiu-jitsu black belt, but Caraway is incredibly underrated in terms of MMA grappling, not just wrestling, but MMA grappling. So he's dangerous in the fact that he could just hold him down for 3 rounds, not do much and win a kind of a boring decision. But on the feet, Caraway has shown still to be a little bit underdeveloped, and I think that's where Assunção's biggest improvements have been. And I think that if he can sprawl and brawl his way out of this, he's gonna beat Caraway. But he has to be careful of the takedowns and just being caught under a wet blanket.
I think a couple of weeks ago, one may have assumed that an Assunção victory on Saturday night would assure him the next title shot against TJ Dillashaw.
Right.
Obviously, that's not going to be the case now with Dominic Cruz re-entering the bantamweight title picture. Assuming, well, not assuming, but let's presume that Assunção is victorious on Saturday night. Who does he face next in the bantamweight division, Riley?
That's a tough one, actually, and it should be a fight that gets him the #1 contention. So you got to give him a guy who's right at the top of the division, and who better to go against than TJ Dillashaw's teammate, and now he's going to have to be resident gatekeeper to the title, Uriah Faber, because he's had all these chances.
Good call.
And late in his career. But I mean, they fought before, and if you didn't know this, Faber actually submitted him in WEC. So I think that Assunção would want a rematch, and I'm thinking Faber would give it to him because just given the fact that Assunção is rated so high.
Sure, and it's been so long since the WEC was even a thing, let alone when Faber was the dominant featherweight champion in that organization. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that's a great potential fight for Assunção. The main event on Saturday evening is second-ranked welterweight Rory McDonald versus ninth-ranked Tarek Saffiedine. Saffiedine, I think, is without a doubt the least known top 10 welterweight in the UFC, in the UFC, just because of his time outside of the organization and the fact that his first fight took place in Singapore on Fight Pass, so kind of outside the eyes of a lot of fans. What is his potential ceiling in the UFC in your opinion?
Saffiedine is going to be a career top 20 guy because if you've watched his career here, late in strikes and early in the UFC so far, he's really, really improved quickly. He went from being a kickboxer to just a well-rounded mixed martial artist, and that is a credit to him working his ass off at Team Quest and really getting the wrestling aspect of the game down, because he doesn't use offensive wrestling very often. He uses it defensively to keep the fight standing, and he uses those baseball-like leg kicks to take the guy's base away from him. So he has several very, very good tools that are going to make him very hard to beat by any fighter in the UFC top 20.
Do you think a Rory McDonald title reign is a foregone conclusion at this point?
I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. I think that if he wins this fight, he is the outright top contender. A fight against Johnny Hendricks would be very interesting. A fight against Robbie Lawler, again, would be very interesting.
Yeah.
I think he's another guy that's still really young, and he's still, he's learning a lot of things. I think that he's going to get better, even which is scary to think about because he's already a top 5 guy in the UFC. He's only going to get better. He's working with GSP. He works out at TriStar. He's this young and he's this good, and he's this athletic and this strong, and this already has this type of resume. And I would like to think that he's going to be a UFC champion in the future, but it's up to him, and pretty much the sky's the limit. And you know what? I think a matchup for him against Johnny Hendricks is very advantageous.
Who do you think wins McDonald or Saffiedine on Saturday evening?
I'm gonna take Rory McDonald. I think that he has the more well-rounded stuff here. He's taken on guys with good striking before, like Saffiedine. If Saffiedine throws an errant leg kick, Rory's going to turn that into a single or a double.
Yeah.
And I think that his striking is good enough where he could stand with Tarek for a while and be successful.
Yeah, I have to agree with you there. McDonald did lose to Robbie Lawler, but there's really nothing about many of his fights that has shown a ton of weakness. And you're absolutely right. You have to think a guy that's as young as he is just continuing to come into his own, and he hasn't even really gotten into his athletic prime yet. So,
right.
We have yet to see Rory McDonald's best stuff. Aside from the 2 fights that we talked about, what's one more that you're really looking forward to for this UFC Fight Night card?
Well, I was really, really looking forward to Mitch Gagnon versus Rob Font, but now that fight's obviously off. So the fight that I'm looking forward to is Elias Theodorou versus Bruno Santos, not for the fact that it's going to be a great fight, but because I don't think Bruno Santos is very exciting. But I am excited to see Elias Theodorou fight because I think he's one of the like Scott Askham I just mentioned on the Sweden card. I think he's another one of the top middleweight prospects in the world. Very well rounded, very tough, and he's going to be a guy that's going to stick around the UFC for a while. Again, won the Ultimate Fighter Nations middleweight tournament in dominant fashion.
I watched that season and loved it. By the way, Team
it was
Canada
great
versus Team Australia, and that was I wrote about it a while back. And it was one of those that made me, for some reason, before I watched it, I was like, I might not be as into this because it's not American fighters. That was a bunch of bullcrap because it was just as fantastic. I respect Elias Theodorou very much, but his attitude and his the amount of self-love that he has kind of makes me want to see him get punched in the face.
He's gonna make for a nice heel in MMA because people are gonna think he's kind of a douche, and if he does break that threshold into the next level, he's gonna be a guy that people want to see get beat up, and he's gonna be that old school wrestling heel that was like an Adonis. So I think that if he can break to stardom, kind of like Conor McGregor did, he's gonna be a guy people are love to hate.
I'm already there. I'm already there with Theodorou, and I've only seen him.
I like him.
I respect him, and he's clearly a great fighter. But I mean, he's just like, hey, how's my hair? How's my hair? I want to see someone punch his hair off.
He's like Adrian Adonis. I love it.
Totally. Well, a little bit different than Adrian Adonis.
Whatever, maybe a little bit, but
people aren't going to be chanting the same things as him that they did at Adrian Adonis, but we won't repeat those here on this show tonight. The last bit of news that I want to talk about before we get to a couple of other items is probably the least surprising bit of news or the least surprising failed drug test since Nick Diaz after his fight with GSP. Of course, I'm talking about Kung Lee failing his test after his fight with, was it Michael Bisping? I'm sorry, you'll have to remind me.
Yes. Yeah, it was. It was in China.
My brain has been a bit of a mush this last month, not only for its usual reasons, but just because of the wedding on top of that as well. That picture came out, and I mean, it almost looked photoshopped, and maybe it was a little bit, but god damn, he looked like the Incredible Hulk, like midway through his transformation from Bruce Banner into the Incredible Hulk. So I think this positive drug test comes as a surprise to absolutely no one. Your thoughts, Mr. Contek?
Yeah, if you looked at Twitter like an hour ago, everybody was just so unsurprised. It was, he had more juice in him than the 1994 Oakland Athletics. He looked like he was gonna put clothes on and they weren't gonna fit, like because his muscles were just so protruding. Like he was gonna put on a pair of jeans, they're gonna turn into like jorts.
John Cena style.
Yeah. He would
I
have
think
fit in with he would have fit in the early '90s WWF though.
that's true.
'Cause
Uh,
Kung Lee looked like he was about to, him and Mr. Perfect were about to, whatever. I'll stop right there.
did you see the Man with the Iron Fists?
No, I did not.
My favorite scene is right at the beginning where Kung Lee is just beating up a bunch of dudes while a Wu-Tang song plays in the background. So
See, that
I
sounds awesome, actually.
I strongly recommend any fan of martial arts cinema see The Man with the Iron Fist. Is it a good movie? No. Is it a fun movie? Absolutely.
I think that any sort of fight that has the Wu-Tang Clan in the background should win some sort of Oscar nomination.
I was personally surprised that it did not win Best Picture, but my tastes differ from the Academy, I suppose.
Well, I mean, if you heard, Wu-Tang Clan in the background, I think that's just a cue to start doing martial arts moves or something.
I karate
I
chopped the
don't know.
crap out of my popcorn.
Oh, okay.
Chris Weidman has been injured, unfortunately, and is out of his UFC 181 match against Vitor Belfort. Of course, that has been postponed until February. Instead, UFC 181 will be headlined by a welterweight title rematch between Robbie Lawler and current champion Johnny Hendricks. Absolutely a fantastic fight, and I think it's one that everybody can agree is a great pay-per-view headliner. We've got 3 more pay-per-views coming up this year in, like I mentioned before, what has been kind of a rough one for the UFC in 2014. Which of the 3 just overall events thus far are you most looking forward to, Riley?
Well, that would be the one you just mentioned, Hendricks versus Lawler. We had
Yeah.
2 title fights on there. And in addition to that, being the MMA nerd that I am, both Ultimate Fighter 19 guys are in action. The winners, Eddie Gordon and Corey Anderson. I want to see how they do. I think they're really, really good prospects. Again, Eddie Gordon, another one of those top middleweight prospects I've been talking about. There's not a lot of them, but the ones that there are, they're very good.
Yeah.
And then you got some good heavyweights on that card. That card's just gonna be all around solid. If it stays healthy, of course, it's still a long time off, so we'll see. But I think UFC 182 or I'm sorry, UFC 181 is going to be off the charts.
Yeah, Lawler versus Hendricks is a fight that intrigues me a lot. I guess the only reason I asked that question is 181 seems like a kind of a easy answer to that one, but Cain Velasquez returns at UFC 180, and he's a guy. Maybe it's because he's a heavyweight, but there's just something about him that really makes me want to pay to watch him do his thing. And I don't know that he's going to have much of a match in Fabricio Verdum, but nevertheless, the fact that it's been so long since we've seen Cain Velasquez in the octagon really makes me excited for that particular fight. Is there a fight outside of UFC 181 that you're particularly looking forward to?
In terms of pay-per-view cards or just in general?
Let's go both.
Okay, pay-per-view, I agree with you. I think Verdum Velasquez is a fight to watch. I think Verdum's a little bit better of a matchup than you're giving him credit for. I think his striking is evolved
Probably.
enough where he could give him fits on the feet, but Velasquez can always just push him against the fence and beat him up. But there's the free card in Austin. I mentioned it before, the Frankie Edgar Cub Swanson fight. That's an awesome fight. That's headlining an awesome free card on Fox Sports 1. That is a card I'm definitely looking forward to.
One card that I'm kind of looking forward to, and I'm, depending on what's going on this Friday, October 3rd, I may end up purchasing it, and depending on its availability on Charter Cable, I have not checked yet. Battlegrounds MMA is bringing back the old one-night tournament to MMA fans. I don't think we can expect a large pay-per-view audience for this, but hardcore MMA fans, and particularly those of us who don't have lives really outside of our living rooms, may end up tuning in. It's a one-night, 8-man welterweight tournament taking place. UFC veterans Cody McKenzie, Brock Larson, Luigi Fioravante, and others are among the participants. One of the most exciting things about this event to me is that it's going to be the first time we actually get to hear good old JR call mixed martial arts, which just alone might be worth the purchase price.
Absolutely.
With Chael Sonnen, of course, by his side doing the color commentary. So my first question for you, Riley, being the encyclopedia of MMA knowledge that you are, which of the 8 welterweights in the tournament do you have winning the whole thing?
Well, I think that Jesse Taylor is going to win. He's coming off that loss in World Series of Fighting to Dave Branch. And that was really surprising. He didn't look like himself in that fight, but if there's one thing about Jesse Taylor, he's a grinder, and this is the perfect format for him because he is a phenomenal cardio, and he's a guy that thrives on just grinding guys out and doing it as efficiently as possible. There's a few guys in the tournament who are late replacements that I don't see them doing too much. Cody McKenzie, I think, is a guy that can slip that guillotine in. He's in good shape, but otherwise,
Yeah.
He's gonna be a guy that's gonna struggle in this tournament, especially because he's fighting up a weight class, I believe.
Agreed.
So I think the two guys to watch out for here are Jesse Taylor and Brock Larson. I think that their wrestling and their grinding ability is what's gonna carry them, but I think ultimately Jesse Taylor is gonna be the guy that takes this tournament.
Yeah, I was always a little bit disappointed with Brock Larson's UFC career because I remember early on he just like ran through at least one or two guys like in really dominant fashion. And then I think he ended up getting beaten by Brian Foster or something like that. This was a long time ago, and I'd have to check the records.
He lost a few fights, yeah.
Yeah. And then I think the one against Foster kind of began his gradual downfall, but. Once again, depending on what's going on Friday night and perhaps the purchase price, I can't imagine this is more than like $30, right?
I would assume, yeah. I think the cable providers or whatever usually set the price and they base it on like demand. So if it's a low demand thing, it's going to probably be cheaper. Like I'd say around $20-25 or so.
Sure.
But if it's $20-25 just to hear Chael and Jim Ross, call the action, it's probably not going to be the most high quality MMA event. But if you got nothing going on Friday, that's a great way to spend $20-25. Get a case of beer and just chill.
Absolutely. If I go out on Friday night instead, I'm going to end up spending way more than $20 or $25. So
yeah, my weekend in Chicago was much more than $20.
Yeah, mine too. My wedding weekend cost a little bit of money.
Well, yeah, I'm sure that cost a few bucks. Yep.
If the UFC did something similar with its best welterweights, who do you think would win a one-night 8-man tournament? Let's say with its top 8.
It would depend on. Okay, yeah. I mean, I think. And who has the best ability to grind? I think. I personally think that Johnny Hendricks is kind of overrated, and I'm going to say that. I think that he lost to Carlos Condit. I thought that Carlos did enough to win 2 of those 3 rounds. And I think that Robbie Lawler has a really good chance of beating him in his next fight. It's hard. It's really, really hard to call at this point. I need to know who the top 8 guys are. But again, a guy like Rory McDonald has a really good chance based on conditioning and all-around skill. So,
damn it! I say damn it because this is like the 3rd time that I've asked a question and had an answer lined up, and you've given that answer. So
I'm sorry about that.
Great minds, I suppose.
That's right.
Battlegrounds MMA is on pay-per-view this weekend. It's on Friday. I'm not sure what time it is. Check your local pay-per-view listings. But it is on pay-per-view, and it is coming from Tulsa, Oklahoma. So be sure to check that out if you're nostalgic for the 8-man one-night tournament.
Or Jim Ross.
Which is a fantastic segue into our traditional last segment here on Combat Press Midweek Report. And, of course, I'm talking about the Wrestling Minute. Riley, as always, I will let you go first.
Yeah, I actually caught Raw last night. I had nothing going on, and I thought that I had mixed emotions about how they booked Dean Ambrose. I think that he's the next great anti-hero in the WWE, and there's a reason why everyone's behind him. It's because he's actually an interesting character. So many times in the WWE, you get these cookie cutter, no gimmick having guys that no one can really get behind. But Ambrose, he's a veteran of wrestling and all this stuff. He's not just a guy that they raised in the Performance Center. He was a guy that was on the Indies for a very long time. He knows what he's doing. He's a mixture of Jake the Snake Roberts and Brian Pillman and even Stone Cold Steve Austin to an extent. So I think that, I liked that he's getting more TV time, and I like that his character's continuing to develop and be in the main event scene. What I don't like is that I don't want the WWE to ruin him for fans, especially their older fans. I thought the segment with the briefcase, it started off very, very well last night. He was throwing the T-shirts in the crowd. He was being himself. That was great. He let Seth Rollins get the briefcase back, and he slimed him, and I was just like, no, that is too childish. That is not something that you would have seen a Stone Cold Steve Austin or a Jake the Snake Roberts do. That's not, he needs to be the vicious anti-hero character. and having him do little stupid childish pranks like that, it's not going to get too many of especially the adults who pay the money. You don't see kids paying money for the pay-per-view. The people who are my age and your age and older who purchase these things, that's not going to get them behind Dean Ambrose. And I really, really want him to succeed.
I think that they're taking care of the little kid fan base with Roman Reigns.
Exactly.
Because you've seen that already. I like Ambrose not only because of all the reasons that you mentioned, but because he's like, I appreciate self-awareness in professional wrestling, and that is, professional wrestling is a fairly absurd pursuit, right? Like, it's this really ostentatious, like, theatrical, violent ballet with, people just saying these ridiculous things to one another. And the fact that Ambrose was in the ring last night and said, "Hey, are you guys actual security?" Or, "I thought you were rosebuds last week," or something like that. Just acknowledging sort of that winking acknowledgement of the absurdity of professional wrestling is something that
I'm sure that line was fed to him, though.
Oh, you think so?
I'm sure Triple H had a hand in that too, because he's known to do that kind of shit. So
sure, even still, that's the character that they're building.
Oh, I thought it was great, though. Yeah,
at least a piece of it, and that's that's something I appreciate. I think he's coming along at exactly the right time. Like, I was thinking about why he's so over and why he's gotten over so quickly, and it's because I think the anti-authority character has always been very popular especially since the Attitude Era. In the WWE, of course, you had Stone Cold Steve Austin kind of creating the archetype for that. But I mean, then think about who two of the biggest stars have been and what their angles have been, what their storylines have been during their most popular periods. And of course, you have to talk about CM Punk and most recently Daniel Bryan. Like, the peak of Daniel Bryan's fame and his overness, if you will, came when he was going up against the Authority. And now that he's gone and now that CM Punk is gone, they needed someone else to fill that mantle, and Dean Ambrose has just done a fantastic job, and he hasn't done it in the same way that CM Punk has done it, or in the same way that Daniel Bryan has done it. I think he's actually done it kind of better. And I think if Stone Cold Steve Austin would have rigged up a briefcase, it would have sprayed Seth Rollins with a bunch of beer.
Yeah, but I still think it would have been dumb. I mean,
no, totally. I guess I don't have as much of a problem with that kind of childlike stuff because, whatever, like I said, professional wrestling is like this absurd pursuit, and I think if 90% of the stuff that they do is like acceptable to me, I'll take the 10% that's kind of stupid. And with a guy like Ambrose, I don't think that there's necessarily, like, they'd have to do a lot to ruin him, and I think that he would have to be complicit in that to ruin him to adult fans. And I'm not saying that I think he would leave the WWE if they were taking his character down a stupid path, but I think that he, at this point, would have enough agency to be able to say, look, is this really the direction you want to take my character? So, while I agree with you that we obviously don't want to see Dean Ambrose's character go the way of a John Cena or the way of what we see Roman Reigns kind of becoming, I think he has enough of that sort of hardcore background to be that sort of figure rather than the guy who's going to be on the Fruity Pebbles box.
Right. Also, I want to say Damian Sandow is still my favorite. He is continuing to just take, like the worst role, something that was just supposed to completely bury him to the bottom of the roster, and
not
just
the moneymaker.
Oh my God, he is just so good at what he does.
Mm-hmm.
And if this doesn't result in him doing something, like, it doesn't have to be huge, but just some sort of push to get him, because even guys like Mick Foley are taking it to Twitter and being like, this guy is outstanding. He is being given the worst, most unattainable role to do anything big with, and he is literally outshining the guy who he's supposed to be mimicking. He's outshining the guy that he's supposed to be the follower or the toady of.
Yeah.
I think that he is outstanding. I can't believe they screwed his character up in the first place. But he is continuing to use his as Jim Ross would say on his blog, he's continuing to use the TV time that he is given and making the most out of it. And that is literally making the most out of it as much as you can.
Hell in a Cell is the next WWE pay-per-view. My one question for you about this, Riley, is will it feature a Cena-Lesnar Hell in a Cell match, an Ambrose-Rollins Hell in a Cell match, perhaps for the briefcase, or both?
I would assume both. I think that it makes sense in both cases booking-wise, and being that it's a Hell in a Cell pay-per-view, they should have more than one. They should probably be two. Lesnar-Cena would make sense because it's technically the rubber match, because the other rubber match was a no contest. And it's also something that will keep the money in the briefcase guy. So that's probably something they can use going forward in storyline. That we're going to put this Hell in the Cell up so Seth Rollins can't come in and ruin this match too. I think that Ambrose Rollins makes sense that they do this because it's just another match that they can have that will continue, in my opinion, the feud of the year. And this might seem a little extensive, but I think this feud should go on all the way to WrestleMania. I could watch these two feud the entire year. And I don't say that about everybody because a lot of times feuds get stale, but Rollins-Ambrose has been so outstanding, and they've found different ways to keep it going that I think that it should be the feud of the year, and B, it should continue to go for many more months.
Well, they should certainly be proud of themselves for the impact that they've made during their short couple of years thus far in WWE, and I'm certainly looking forward to seeing where their careers go.
Yeah.
That's going to be about it for this episode of the Combat Press Midweek Report. Of course, go to combatpress.com every day for all the latest news, interviews, and opinion in the world of mixed martial arts. Follow Combat Press on Twitter at Combat Press, and like our Facebook page. You can follow Riley, the man with the dope-ass Hartford Whalers hat, on Twitter at Big Riles MMA, and you can follow me, Eric Reinert, at Reinert Eric. Once again, visit all of our great colleagues at combatpress.com for all the latest fantastic information in the world of mixed martial arts. And come back to combatpress.com every Tuesday at 9:30 Eastern Time for another episode of the Combat Press Midweek Report. For Riley Contek, my name is Eric Reinert. Thank you so much for tuning in this week, and enjoy the fights this weekend.